everybody, this is the second video to help you for your exam on Monday. This is the layout of the exam, paper 2, which is on macroeconomics. So it includes the theory in theme 2 and theme 4. And there's a video that I've made covering the theory in theme 2. There's the first video that I've made for theme 4, and this is the second video for theme 4. So this is the layout for the exam. And now I'm going to continue going through the theory. So the next topic is absolute and relative poverty. If somebody is in absolute poverty, this means that they can't afford their basic needs. This is shelter, food, warmth, and clothing. They would be the basic ones. And sometimes this is defined as somebody who's living on less than $1.50 or $2 a day. Somebody who's in relative poverty is poor compared to other people living in that country. And there are lots of different definitions of this, but one of the most common is somebody who's living on less than 60% of the median income in that country. And in a country, you could be measuring either of these. There is an argument that even in the UK at the moment, we have people in absolute poverty because there are people who are using food banks. They can't afford to buy food. Inequality, there are two different types of inequality, particularly that you can look at. Wealth inequality, which is where some people hold more wealth than others. That means they're holding more assets like houses or shares or other assets. And income inequality is where there's a difference between people based on the income that they are earning. Income is your salary or wage. It could also be benefits or a pension, for example. Remember that wealth is a stock concept and income is a flow concept. You can be looking at income and wealth inequality within a country, but also between countries. The Lorentz curve shows you a way of measuring income inequality. Remember that the axes for this, the y-axis is cumulative percentage of income, and the x-axis is cumulative percentage of population. And the 45-degree line shows that there's complete equality in distribution of income. The further away the Lorentz curve is from the 45-degree line, the more unequal that economy is in income distribution. The Gini coefficient can be calculated using the Lorentz curve. The area between the Lorentz curve and the 45-degree line is A. The rest of the area below that going down to the x-axis is B. And you calculate the Gini coefficient, it's A divided by A plus B. If the Gini coefficient is 1, that means one person has all of the income. If it's less than 1, the smaller it gets, the more equal society. If it's 0, there's complete equality of income in that country. There are different causes of this inequality of income and wealth within countries and between countries. One can be to do with the access to jobs, so the different incomes that people might have, and that can come down to where somebody lives, whether there is equal opportunity for men and women, whether there's nepotism, people get jobs because of who they know, whether there's a disparity in education within the country, and also to do with individual circumstances. Also, if you hold assets, wealth, you can make income out of those assets. For example, if you own shares, you can earn dividends. If you own a second home, you can rent it out and receive rent, which would be income. Wealth inequality, this is where some people hold more assets than other people. And this can be because people inherit money and therefore they can use that money to buy assets. They may inherit assets. Also, if you have income inequality, it's likely to lead in the long run to wealth inequality, because having more income allows you to buy assets, so to have wealth, and then you can use the wealth to make income. So it's a circle really that goes round and round. The tax system within a country can impact income and wealth inequality. It depends how income and wealth are taxed within that country, and also redistribution via a welfare state and via benefits can spread this out more evenly. You can look at these inequalities inside a country, but then also between countries. If you're looking between countries, you'd be looking at why people earn more money, receive more income from perhaps other sources like benefits in some countries, whereas in other ones they have very low incomes, or why there's a lot of wealth in some countries and not others. If there is economic growth, so if there's an increase in real output in an economy, we know that incomes will go up, and it may be that people on the lowest incomes benefit from this, or they might not. Economic growth can lift people out of absolute poverty, but sometimes it can increase relative poverty. It might be that the people who own businesses see a bigger increase perhaps in their wealth, in the value of their shares, than the people who are working within businesses. Their incomes might not increase very much when there's economic growth. You need to look at the individual situation and statistics to determine whether economic growth is increasing or decreasing income and wealth inequality. If there's development in a country, it may well be that a lot more people have an income because they have jobs now. However, it may be that some people who already hold a lot of wealth and own businesses actually do better out of the development within the country. If you have capitalism, this means that you can own assets for yourself and that you can keep the money that you receive from running a business or from doing a job. You can then start a business, but capitalism means that you get to keep the proceeds of your efforts. If you had the complete opposite, you would have a command economy, and factors of production would be allocated by the government, and all income would be evenly distributed. Some people say that capitalism will result in inequality. If you had complete equality of income, if people received an income but then it was shared out between everybody, there's an argument that that would disincentivize people from working hard and setting up businesses because they wouldn't be able to keep the fruits of their labor. So some people say that you can't have equality completely within capitalism. Ways of measuring development. The Human Development Index measures 3 key factors: the education that someone has and expected years in education, their life expectancy at birth, and also GDP per capita at purchasing power parity. And these 3 factors give some indication of how developed an economy is. If the HDI is 0, that's the lowest it can be. If it gets up to 1, that's the highest that it can be, the most developed it could be on these standards. If you're using HDI to compare development between countries, it is good because it's looking at 3 key factors which impact development. However, you don't know whether the data that's being collected within the countries is completely accurate. Also, you don't know what the quality of education is like, and you don't know how well that GDP is actually distributed between people. Is it evenly distributed or not? Are there other big impacts which affect people's lives? There are some other indicators of development. The inequality HDI, that's where the measure also includes factors to do with inequality between people within the country. So you could argue that this is a fairer measure of development within a country. And the multidimensional poverty index, this is looking at a lot of different factors which affect whether somebody is in poverty or not, a much wider range of factors than HDI. There are a lot of factors which will influence how much economic growth and development there is within a country. Remember that economic growth is an increase in real output. That's real economic growth, or potential economic growth is an increase in productive potential. And this doesn't necessarily mean if you have economic growth that you have development, but it could do. So factors which influence these 2 things: having poor infrastructure, so this is things like roads, sanitation, ports, broadband, water systems, electricity in a country. Human capital inadequacy, this means that people within a country may be in poor health. They might also have low skills, low education. An economy might be dependent on producing primary products and stuck in the primary sector. This will mean that they are dependent and beholden to the world price for that product, which could fall significantly. Also, if they're producing soft commodities, so crops, generally speaking, over time, as incomes around the world increase, demand for those products won't increase significantly. And therefore, over time, the price of those goods won't be increasing. Demand won't go up for them. That's the Prebisch-Singer hypothesis. Some countries' development and economic growth might be limited due to a savings gap. This is explained by the Harrod-Domar model, which says that a country has to have savings within it in order for banks to have money to be able to lend to businesses and to people. This has actually been slightly discounted now because people and businesses within a country are capable to borrow from other countries. The savings don't have to occur within that economy itself. It may be that people within the country, firms, have very little capital accumulation. This means that they haven't built up machinery within the economy, and therefore they're unable to operate in the secondary sector, for instance, rather than the primary sector. So they can't manufacture goods, which actually adds more value, and generally manufactured goods can be sold for more than primary products. There might also be a foreign currency gap. This means that money is not flowing into the country as much as it's flowing out. Not enough foreign currency is being earned to be able to help the economy, for instance, invest and improve infrastructure to help them with growth and development. Capital flight is what happens when people within an economy move their money out of the country for a reason. It could be that there are predictions that the value of the currency will fall significantly, so people are selling the currency. And that can also be a self-fulfilling prophecy, because if a lot of people sell the currency, supply of it would increase and it would depreciate in a floating exchange rate system. It might also be that there's unrest or war within a country. People are fearing for the future of the economy and thinking that the value of the currency will fall. So they remove their money from that economy out of the currency. And if there isn't money in the country, then there isn't money for investment and development and economic growth. Corruption is what some people think is a tax on countries, because this is money being lost within the system through corruption, and it often means that governments can't operate efficiently and taxation isn't used to help the economy. And also, for instance, that aid and loans aren't used effectively within the country because they're being siphoned off by officials or people in government. And this would then prevent them from having significant economic growth and development through a lack of funds. Population issues. It may be that an economy has a very high birth rate. They have a lot of dependents, small children within the country, and a smaller workforce. And it may be that they have therefore lower productive potential than possible. However, this will change in the future when the children grow up and then they become of a working age. There might be issues to do with having a lot of people who are older who now aren't working or don't have skills, and not having enough people who stay within the country to be able to stimulate the economy and work there. People might be leaving the economy because they believe that they have better prospects in another country, and this would affect the opportunity for growth and development due to a lack of labour. An economy may be in debt to other countries in the world. They may have borrowed money, perhaps via bonds, and it may be that they're using a lot of tax revenue to pay off debts, and therefore that tax revenue can't be used to develop the economy. There might be poor governance. The government themselves and officials and organizations within the country might be run poorly as well as being corrupt, and this will mean that structures can't be put in place to help the economic development within the economy. And also policies can't be set, which are sound economic policies to help the economy to develop and grow. If an economy is in civil war or political instability, this could well mean that people are leaving the country and there is brain drain. This will reduce the amount of entrepreneurship within the economy. It'll reduce the amount of labour. Also, in a war, there may well be destruction of infrastructure. The capital within the economy may be damaged, and people are also possibly leaving the country, or people are dying in the war. And this would be reducing the labour and the entrepreneurship within the country. Potentially also large areas of land and natural resources might be compromised or unusable in the future due to, for instance, mines being placed in certain areas. Finally, the geography of a country can really impact its economic growth and development. For example, if a country is landlocked, then trade will be very difficult. Within Africa, the geography of countries there, that there may not be infrastructure connecting different countries, and there may not be cooperation between countries. And this can mean that it's much harder to trade and to move products and supplies around between countries. Also, if a country has a large mountain range, or they have very poor weather, or they are in a place in the world where they have, for instance, mosquito-borne diseases, these things can really impact the economic development within a country and growth. A point here to make about economic development, it doesn't have one specific definition, so you can query what economic development is. There are so many different ways of measuring it. Strategies which can influence growth and development, these can be market-orientated or interventionist. If they're market-orientated, this involves the government getting involved in other way around. Market-orientated is where the free market is left to work on its own. There is not intervention by government. Interventionist is where the government intervenes and gets involved in the economy to do something so that it hopefully increases the possibility of the economy experiencing economic growth and or development. Market-orientated, where the government are stepping away and leaving things to the market, they might liberalize trade by removing tariffs and quotas and other protectionism from exports and imports. Also, they could promote foreign direct investment into the economy, so they can make it easier, perhaps removing regulations so that FDI comes into the country more easily. They may remove subsidies to firms, so this will force firms to be more competitive and more efficient. They'll be cutting their costs, and this will hopefully make them more internationally competitive in the long run and be able to compete with imports. Introducing a floating exchange rate where before it may have been fixed or managed, this will potentially allow the exchange rate to correct problems in the economy regarding exports and imports. If the currency is in very low demand under a floating exchange rate, that will make the currency depreciate, which would make it easier for the economy to export because their exports would become cheaper. Remember, spiced, strong pound, imports cheap, exports dear, and it works vice versa. Also, the introduction of microfinance schemes. This is again where the government is stepping away. This would probably be done by the private sector, which is where money is being lent to individuals on a small basis at very low rates of interest, and often where the person has no security. They can't secure the loan against an asset. But the idea of this is that individuals, that's often given to women who are in data, they're seen to be more reliable, to set up small businesses, to be able to use money so that they can make a little bit more money than they would be able to if they didn't receive the loan. The government might also privatize industries, which would mean that they would become more competitive and they would be trying to be more efficient because they'll have a profit motive. Also, through privatizing, it's no longer one entity that's run by government, it's lots of businesses which are competing with each other. Theoretically, this will make the country's businesses more efficient, prices lower, more internationally competitive if they export, and better able to compete with imports. Interventionist strategies, this is where the government are getting involved. They're doing something, usually spending money, to help the prospects for economic growth and development. Developing human capital, this would be through education or training. So think about how expensive this would be, what would the quality be, would it actually improve human capital within the economy, and over what time scale. They might introduce protectionism, so they put tariffs and quotas in place to protect infant industries within the country, to protect jobs within the country, and so that people living in the country are more likely to buy domestically produced products. The risk with this is that trading partners retaliate, so they put tariffs on exports from this country, and that harms the economy and could limit the prospects for export-led growth. The government could introduce with their central bank a managed exchange rate system. This would be where they would be manipulating the value of the currency, devaluing or revaluing, mostly to impact the amount of exports and imports, and potentially the price of imported raw materials. Infrastructure development, this is where the government are building infrastructure or subsidizing the building of infrastructure, for instance, roads, rail, ports, airports, broadband, sanitation systems, these things which will enable the country to develop further. They may promote joint ventures with global companies so that the domestic firms can benefit from working with global companies. They may be able to increase their profits, but also gain skills by having these tie-ups with global companies. The government might put in place a buffer stock scheme. This has a diagram for it. This is where the government is keeping stocks of a certain, usually commodity, something that can be stored. It might be, for example, grain. And if the price goes too high, they will release stocks onto the market to increase the supply and therefore lower the price. If the price gets too low, the government will buy up the excess supply in the market to a certain extent so that it raises the price. And this would be to protect people who are operating in a certain industry, for instance, growing wheat in that example. Other strategies that could be used to improve the prospects for growth and development, there could be trying to encourage a movement out of the primary sector into the secondary sector, into manufacturing and industrialization. The Lewis model says that you can improve the productivity of workers, marginal productivity of labor, if they move out of the primary sector and into the secondary sector. And therefore you can get more out of your labor and your economy, your productive potential increases. Also, generally speaking, secondary sector manufactured goods, more value is added to the product and therefore they can be sold at higher prices than primary products. Tourism could be introduced as a strategy to develop and have economic growth, particularly if there are sites that can be seen, beautiful countryside within a country, and people want to come to see that or perhaps to learn about the history in that country. Tourism can be relatively cheap as a method of improving economic development because it can be low-level tourism which isn't expensive. It doesn't have to be high-end hotels. There are lots of different forms of tourism. Focusing on the primary industries, it could be that government encourages primary industries and does use those as a means of leading to economic growth and development. For instance, they could give subsidies, they could put in place these buffer stock schemes, and then the government could use the taxes from those industries in order to develop other areas of the economy. Be careful if you're looking at primary products in primary industries. It could be that it's a hard commodity, something which sells for a lot of money, like gemstones or metals, or you could be looking at soft commodities, crops, and there's a big difference depending on which one is being produced. Fair trade is where people working in a certain industry are receiving a fair price for their products. So, for example, a lot of bananas on sale in the UK now are fair trade. That means that people who are growing the bananas, who have the fair trade affiliation, will receive a higher price for their bananas. This is considered good because they receive a better income, it's more reliable. However, this can increase the supply of that commodity, which actually for those outside the fair trade agreement would actually be bad for them because prices can fall. So it doesn't necessarily benefit everybody. Aid can be given to a country as humanitarian aid when there's a crisis, when they might be given food, clothing, and water, for example, and shelter. But it can also be aid which is given in less dire circumstances in the form of assistance with setting up schools, lending money on preferential rates. It can also be advising on development of the economy. It could also be giving food or capital over the long term. Debt relief is where an economy has their debt written off or reduced. So this is money that they owe to other countries, their national debt. If they have debt relief, this will mean that the government will have more tax revenue to spend on other things which they would have previously been using to service their debt. One of the problems with debt relief is that it could mean that in future people wouldn't want to lend to that economy because they wouldn't trust them being able to pay it back. There are also government institutions in the world and NGOs which can help with economic development and growth in countries. The World Bank and the International Monetary Fund give loans and advice essentially to economies to help them to be able to grow and improve their economic growth and development. Very often they will give loans with conditions attached, and this is considered a negative impact often of these organizations. They're very keen generally on free trade, removing protectionism, and having export-led growth for economies. Some people think that the conditions attached by the World Bank and the IMF actually can do more harm than good for those economies, and there are questions about whether they know better than people on the ground within the economy. Some also say that their goals and the objectives with helping are so extreme in the quantity that there are, that they're not focused on one thing or a couple of things, and therefore they lose their way and don't actually help with economic growth and development. Non-government organizations can often operate in developing countries to help, but there can be a question around, again, do they understand the place that they're operating in as well as the people from that country? Is there a lot of overlap between different NGOs? Are they being inefficient? Also, are the NGOs doing work which is actually harming the economy in that country because, for instance, they're giving out free food, free clothing, free medical services, which means that businesses offering those services actually lose a market and the whole economy is disrupted. Financial markets, if these are set up within an economy, it enables the economy to grow because it enables people to save money and be able to borrow money. In Western countries, we're generally used to having financial markets and we can save money in the bank, we can borrow money. This enables individuals and firms to be able to grow in what they're doing because they have access to money that otherwise they wouldn't have. Financial markets allow people and businesses to save money. Also, they can borrow money. Having a financial market, for instance, a banking system, allows people and businesses to exchange goods and services much more easily. If you have access to a banking system, you can sell your products to somebody in another area and the money will be safely transferred to you when you sell something. They also provide forward markets, financial markets. If you could have a forward market for a currency or a commodity, this reduces risk for businesses generally. If you are buying something and using another currency, there's the risk that your currency will appreciate or depreciate against that currency in future, so that suddenly, if it depreciates, you won't be able to buy as much of that currency in the future. So what you can do is you can make a contract now to agree to buy a fixed amount of that currency in future at a price fixed today. This creates certainty for your business and it will be much easier to plan and to look forward to how you're going to grow your business and how you're going to operate. You can have forward markets in commodities. For example, if your business is buying wheat in order to make something like bread, they could agree now a contract to buy wheat in the future at a price fixed today. These are markets which are set up within financial markets using usually banks. If you don't have a financial market and a financial system with banking systems, you probably wouldn't be able to easily set up forward markets in currencies and commodities. The final thing, banking systems enable businesses to raise money through issuing shares. Financial markets provide a market for equities. This is where firms can sell shares to raise money, and then those shares can be bought and sold. Without this, firms can struggle to be able to raise enough money to grow. And if a firm can grow, it can potentially then start to compete internationally. There can be market failure in the financial sector. Just like any other market failure, this is where the price mechanism results in a misallocation of resources. This is specifically in the banking sector where you may have market failure. You can have asymmetric information where one side to a transaction has more information than the other. For example, somebody might take out a loan when they don't fully understand the terms of it. Somebody might buy a financial product thinking that it will make them money in the future, but they didn't receive enough information and actually they lose money. Had they known all of the information, they wouldn't have bought the product in the first place. The financial sector can result in externalities, negative externalities particularly. For example, in the financial crisis in the UK, the government bought certain banks which were failing. They used taxpayers' money to do that. So a negative externality of that purchase of the banks was that the third party, the taxpayers, didn't get their tax revenue spent on them in future. It was spent on purchasing banks instead, and they could have argued that that didn't benefit them directly. Moral hazard can occur in the financial sector. This is where banks, for example, behave irresponsibly and take big risks because they know that they'll be bailed out by the government, as happened in the financial crisis when some of these banks were saved. And this moral hazard makes them take more risks than they would do otherwise. It's the same thing as someone having an insurance policy for their mobile phone. They know it will pay out if they drop the phone, so they're not careful with the phone. The backing up of the financial sector has potentially led to a lot more risk being taken. The financial sector can result in speculation and market bubbles which can pop and harm people. For instance, before the financial crisis, the banks were lending money to people who probably shouldn't have been lent money. They were very high-risk individuals who wouldn't have necessarily been able to pay back the loan and the interest if interest rates went up or if the economy went into a downturn. By lending this money to people who probably were risky, it allowed them to buy things such as properties, causing property prices to go up. And then when interest rates did go up, suddenly a lot of people couldn't pay back loans, and suddenly the value, for instance, of houses that everybody had been demanding and buying went down, as those people were forced to sell the houses, and the supply of houses went up, and this meant the price went down. If the financial sector hadn't lent money to these people, potentially these market bubbles might not have been created. Finally, in the financial sector, you can have market rigging. This is where banks, usually within the financial sector, they collude, so they fix interest rates, for example, or they fix the price of financial products. And this means that there isn't proper competition and that consumers can suffer. Also, if they fix interest rates, for example, lending to businesses, this means that businesses aren't operating within a system where there is competition in the financial sector. Central banks in an economy, for example, in the UK, the Bank of England, and in Europe, in the Eurozone, the European Central Bank, these banks put in place monetary policy. So that will be setting interest rates and putting in place quantitative easing, potentially increasing the supply of money. Remember, quantitative easing is where the central bank buys debt from banks as a way of putting money into those commercial banks. The idea is that the commercial banks then lend the money to others. It's a way of putting more money into the circular flow of income, into the economy. The central bank is also a banker to the government, so that means that they deal with holding the tax revenue that the government collects in. They may also deal with issuing bonds for the government. They are a banker to the banks, the lender of last resort. So if a commercial bank doesn't have enough funds sitting within the bank when customers who have deposited the money ask for that money back, then the bank can go to the central bank for a loan so that they can pay people who want to take out the money that they believe has been deposited in that bank. Finally, central banks can have a role in regulating the banking industry, so putting in place parameters within which the finance industry must operate and banks must operate, and trying to monitor what the banks are doing so that they're not taking on too much risk and causing potential problems for customers within the banking industry.